Good morning, kiddos. Back in my deer stand. Yep. So, talking about Greg. Greg was, as I said then, a character. Greg was born in 1959. And by the time he was about 6 years old, he had decided that his goal in life was to be the number one redneck in the country. We grew up not poor, but very simple. My dad was a welder. My mom was a secretary. But we had a choice about how we dressed and how we conducted ourselves. And Greg's choice was to drop off the lower end of the redneck scale. He reveled in being a redneck, being the best redneck that's possible. So if you keep that in mind as you listen to these stories, you'll understand him a lot better. And you might understand the family's frustration with dealing with him. I mean, we were all considered Arkansas rednecks, so why not try to climb above that? No, with Greg, no, he loved being a redneck. For instance, my dad welded together some bicycles for us. We had the cool little Stingray bicycles, but they weren't Stingray brand. My dad made them, but he made them look like a Stingray bicycle with a long banana seat. They were cool. Greg didn't like his. Greg wanted a unicycle. So my dad made him a unicycle. And we lived about a mile from school, and we had to ride our bikes to school every day. So Greg, in the third grade, the rest of us jumped on our bikes, took off, and left him. He taught himself how to ride the unicycle, and he would put his books in a backpack and get on his unicycle and meander through all the neighborhoods to get to the school in the town where we lived. It was crazy, but it achieved the purpose that Greg wanted. He wanted attention. So when the rest of us pulled up, we had nice metal bike racks outside the school. We would pull our front wheel into the rack and stow it for the day. Not Greg. He would ride it into the classroom and stow it in the corner so everybody could see it. The only way he got away with that is because all the teachers loved him. Even though he was irritating as hell, they loved him. So you see this skinny, blonde-headed kid riding his unicycle through town, sweating like crazy. And you'd think, wow, wish he had discovered the other wheel. Sure would have made life easier for him. But no, Greg wanted that. He was a nut. He, early on, when we were kids, we didn't have plastic bags. People laugh about that now, but they just weren't around. They weren't invented yet. But when they were, Greg was about 15, I think, when you started seeing trash can liners, big ones, like for a 55-gallon barrel, black. They were all black. And Greg loved them because for him, that was like magic. You could put anything you wanted in it, tie it up on top with a piece of twine, and it was waterproof and it was portable. So he could throw it in whatever he had, even on his unicycle. He could carry his belongings. And it was irritating because every time you'd go looking for him, he'd have his plastic bag, he'd have his change of clothes and some toiletries and a blanket to sleep under. So he was always ready to be a hobo anywhere he went. And he did that a lot. He would travel with friends and, they'd get tired of him and leave him. He'd have his plastic bag full of goodies. But it reminded me this morning, Greg never really flew, even though we had opportunities to fly a lot. I became a pilot. He would fly with me occasionally, but he only flew on a jet 3 times, I think. The second time was my mother had moved to California and remarried, and she wanted Greg and I to come out and visit. So I got us tickets, and I called him up because I knew about his propensity to use a black plastic bag. I said, Greg, listen, I've got some extra suitcases. I want you to use one of them to pack your things in so we can go on this trip. He said, no, I got it covered. I said, no, really, Greg, it's kind of embarrassing. You don't need the plastic bags. He said, no, that's the way I travel. So I gave up. So the time came for us to leave, and I went by his house. Here comes Greg out with the biggest black plastic bag I've ever seen. It was like for a 55-gallon barrel liner, real thick plastic. And I mean, it was stuffed full. It looked like something Santa Claus would carry all his toys. And I said, what in the hell do you have in there? He said, I've got my sleeping bag, my clothes, he rattled off. I've got some stuff Mom wanted me to bring out. And I was like, gosh, Greg, that's going to be so embarrassing. He said, not for me, only for you. So, okay, so I loaded it up. We drove to the airport, got through check-in, which back then wasn't as bad as it is now. We got through check-in, everybody was like, what in the hell is in that bag? I didn't think they'd take it because it was so large, but they did, and it met the weight requirements. But this was back 40 years ago, so we're flying into John Wayne International Airport, which is a small airport in downtown LA. And for people who live there, it's a convenient airport, and that's why we flew there. So my mom and her new husband were going to meet us at this airport. Now, her new husband, we had not met yet. And so this was going to be a kind of important get-together. So we flew, and of course, Greg was nauseated and fascinated with flying, looking out the window and wondering when the wings were going to fall off. And we got to LA and we landed, and we had to go into baggage claim. And so we stood there, Mom and her husband were there, and we met them, and everybody hugged and kissed, and we were waiting all together in baggage claim for our baggage to come. And here comes my suitcase, which was just a backpack. And I was like, oh Lord, I hope nothing happens with Greg's bag of goodies. And all of a sudden, the alarm starts going off on the baggage claim deal. And it was a big conveyor. You've seen them, but this one came down off the side of a wall, a big black conveyor belt coming down, and another conveyor belt that it dumped onto that went in a circle. Very fancy for back then. And so people's luggage was dropping down the conveyor belt, hitting the circle conveyor belt, and it was carrying the luggage to everyone. So I got mine, and we were waiting. The alarm went off. And I was like, I immediately knew something bad was going to happen. And all of a sudden, up at the top of this elevated conveyor belt, pecans start popping and blowing out of the conveyor belt, the underneath side of it. And I was like, pecans? What in the hell? Surely no. Greg said, hey, Mom, those are your pecans I brought for you. I said, Greg, you brought pecans? He said, yeah, Mom said she wanted some pecans. He had put 5 gallons of unshelled pecans in this plastic bag. I need to hold my voice down. I think I see a deer down there. Anyhow, and this thing had gotten caught in the belt of the conveyor, and it had ripped the bottom of the bag open. And of course, pecans were on the bottom of the bag. And so they start shooting out. They were getting bound up in the conveyor belt, and it was trying to continue turning. It was jamming it up. That's what had caused the alarm. And pecans were shooting out, and people were standing there dodging them. We were getting pelted Greg's pecans, and parts of his bag were starting to come out, and all of a sudden the conveyor belt just kind of vomited his clothes and his sleeping bag that he brought. When they got down to the circle part of it, I grabbed them and I said, "We're getting out of here now." And Mom was like, "What's going on?" I said, "Mom, those are your pecans. We're leaving them. We're leaving now." Greg wanted to fight me so he could stay there and collect them. I said, "No, Greg, this is stupid. We're getting out of here." So we vamoosed. We left the premises. Oh, goodness, that boy. And for him, a great weekend, his favorite weekend, would be to get in his 14-foot flat-bottom boat. And you could always tell it was Greg. You could be across the lake. And this is a big lake, a big Arkansas lake. You could be on the other side of the lake. You could tell if it was Greg because it'd have 3 or 4 big black plastic bags with all of his survival stuff. He'd put anything he had. He even put his ice chest in a garbage bag. He'd pile them into his boat. He could barely see over them. He'd take off across the lake. He'd find his island that he loved to camp on, and that's where he'd be for the next 2 or 3 days. Just another Greg story.